You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, thank you for joining The American Revolution. This week, episode 340, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. In January of 1786, the Virginia legislature passed the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. This was seen as a landmark change, not only for Virginia, but one that it would eventually spread throughout the Union. The notion of religious freedom was a departure from the customary practices in Europe. For centuries, European powers had an official state religion. In good times, they tolerated other religions and treated the practitioners as second-class citizens. In bad times, practitioners of unapproved religions were imprisoned, expelled, tortured, or executed. Religion was closely tied to the state. Worshipping differently from the sovereign was often seen as a form of treason. For centuries prior to this time, Roman Catholicism dominated Western and Central Europe, with Orthodox Christianity dominating to the east of that. Outside of a handful of places that tolerated Judaism, most other non-Christian religions were forbidden. When Martin Luther went against the Catholic Church in the early 1500s, that set off a wave of Protestantism in Europe that divided the continent into primarily Catholics and Protestants. Protestantism generally took hold in Northern Europe, with most of the South remaining Catholic. England took an odd turn since it had originally largely remained Catholic until Henry VIII formed the Church of England, mostly just to get around the Pope's prohibition on him divorcing his wife. While England joined the Protestant world, Anglicanism kept many of the Catholic beliefs and traditions, just mostly removing papal authority. Within England, there were Protestants who wanted to make actual religious changes that went well beyond what the Church of England had done. Separatists and Puritans fought with the Church of England at times to reform its practices, and at other times simply to form a truly separate Protestant church that was more in line with the Lutheran and Calvinist practices of Northern Europe. Other new religions sprouted up in England as well, such as the Society of Friends, better known as the Quakers. There were others in England and in other parts of Britain also who insisted on remaining Catholic. So all of this deeply divided the country. The English government and later the government of a united Britain cracked down on dissenters with differing levels of hostility at different times. Sometimes dissenters would be treated like second-class citizens and denied certain rights. Other times they would be jailed, fined, or worse. Many religious dissenters from Britain were able to find a home in the colonies, where British officials seemed to tolerate greater levels of religious dissent. Many states, though, including Virginia, were established as Anglican colonies, where the Church of England remained the official religion. Religious dissenters might be permitted to live in the colony, but they would be subject to the denial of certain rights. They would also be obligated to pay taxes to support the Church of England in Virginia. There were groups of Baptists, Lutherans, Presbyterians who had established communities in Virginia, but they had to fund their own churches privately while also providing tax dollars for the Church of England. Like Mother England, there were times when Virginia colonial governments cracked down on these other religions. In the years leading up to the Revolutionary War, about half of all Presbyterian ministers were in jail just for preaching. Many Baptist ministers were also arrested. Even before the Revolutionary War began, there were considerable numbers of people who opposed the state support of the Anglican Church in Virginia. Now, you may remember way back in episode 17 of this podcast, I talked about how Patrick Henry had made a name for himself arguing against the payment of the clergy in the early 1760s. Now, following independence, there was no guarantee that the legal protections for the financial support of the Anglican Church in Virginia would remain in place. Following the war, the Anglican Church in America rebranded itself as the Episcopal Church. Many Virginians were moving towards the idea that the state should not provide financial support to any religion, and among those leaders, Thomas Jefferson took a prominent role. It's difficult to say with certainty what Jefferson's inner beliefs on God and religion were. Like most people, they probably evolved over time. Beyond that, many men who might have rejected the idea of God altogether might not have been willing to articulate that idea, especially in writing. In many cases, atheists would not have been permitted to vote, hold office, or face many other legal restrictions. Many historians have argued that Jefferson was a deist. A deist is someone who holds some general belief in an intelligent creator, but not a God that answers prayers or regularly intervenes in human affairs. Deism had grown in popularity over the 17th and 18th centuries. Many men who focused more on logic and science seemed drawn to this concept as their religious belief. This seems consistent with what Jefferson said about religion as an adult. Many of us have heard about the so-called Jefferson Bible. Jefferson took a standard Bible and essentially summarized all the moral teachings of Jesus in it, while cutting out all the stories of miracles and supernatural events. And I should add that this is something that he created for his own research and kept in his personal library. It's not something that he ever published during his lifetime or expected to share with other people. By all appearances, Jefferson wanted to focus on the teaching about moral behavior while rejecting all the rest of it as superstition. Jefferson sometimes spoke about God's wrath for sinful behavior, but again, we don't know exactly how to understand this in the terms of his inner beliefs. While Jefferson was baptized as an Anglican, he did not regularly attend that church or any other particular church. He did attend churches as an adult, but he went to different ones all the time. We also know that he refused to become a godfather for the child of a close friend, writing that he did not sufficiently believe in the Anglican teachings enough to qualify for that role. Whatever his thoughts on God and religion, we can say with certainty that Jefferson became an outspoken opponent of state support for any churches. In 1776, he and Madison had argued for the repeal of all tax support for the church. And while these efforts failed, it made clear where Jefferson stood on the issue. In 1779, after being elected governor of Virginia, Jefferson put forward 126 different bills that he had worked on several years earlier while serving on a committee with George Wythe and Edmund Pendleton. These bills represented a wide variety of issues, which focused on updating Virginia's statutes more generally so that the laws reflected an independent state rather than a British colony. Bill number 82 was entitled, quote, "A Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom." The bill started with a long preamble stating why it made no sense for a government to put restrictions on religious beliefs. Among other things, it said, quote, that to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. It then concluded that, quote, no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. At this time, of course, the Revolutionary War was still raging, and legislatures were unwilling to take on this or many other of Jefferson's revolutionary proposals. While many men supported religious toleration, that was different from religious freedom. Religious toleration allowed for a state religion that was supported by tax dollars. At the same time, it tolerated the existence of other religions that had to support themselves. For these men, Jefferson's idea of religious freedom that prevented any tax dollars from going to any church was just too far. They argued that no church could survive in this way. Not enough people would give sufficient funds voluntarily to support the church. They believed that established religion was necessary to maintain morality among the population, and that these taxes were necessary for that established religion. Of course, Jefferson and others disagreed. For Jefferson, it was education, not religion, that was the key to a moral and virtuous people. Jefferson viewed most organized religion as standing against science and reason that he wanted to encourage. With the war still raging, the legislature tabled the measure. Governor Jefferson would leave office without any legislative action. A few years later, in his Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson continued to argue that religion was an inappropriate purpose for government. He wrote, quote, "The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others." He continued, "But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." He further noted that true religion did not need the support of the state. Only, quote, "error needs the support of government. Truth can stand by itself." After Jefferson left for France, debate over support for religion grew stronger. The vast majority of the Virginia population and the vast majority of its legislators in Virginia had been Anglicans. But there had been a growing battle over what that even meant. Many Anglicans were divided on this and other issues. As I said, they wanted to embrace independence from the Church of England, and that's why the churches in America rebranded themselves as Episcopalians. A minister from Fairfax, Virginia, David Griffith, organized a meeting of ministers in Richmond in April 1784. Griffith saw a grave threat in the loss of state revenues and believed that without a united effort, the church in America would be destroyed. The result of this meeting would kick off an assessment drive to petition the Virginia Assembly to raise a tax assessment to fund the Episcopal ministers. Before acting on the assessment, the clergy proposed a bill that would create a corporation within the state under which the Episcopal clergy could operate. It would establish church laws and regulations and called for the election of clergy, which gave them control of church properties. This bill effectively took control of the church hierarchy by handing all power to locally elected clergy. Madison and the reformers supported this bill, but Governor Patrick Henry managed to kill it. An amended bill established lay delegates in each parish so that the old Anglican leadership would still play a role in church policy, and there would still be some mixing of church and state. The reformers, as well as smaller religions, especially the Presbyterians, greatly opposed this final bill. It essentially still treated the Episcopalians as the official religion of Virginia. In response, legislators offered to create a state corporation for any other church that wanted it, but none of them did. The other churches, along with reformers like Madison, wanted a complete separation of church and state. That fall, the Presbyterians moved to a new strategy. They appointed a commission of 4 ministers to work with the legislature. They moved for state support of religion generally, as necessary for maintaining morality among the population. Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee took up this campaign, and in the spring of 1785, they supported a, quote, provision for teachers of the Christian religion. Proponents argued that, quote, a general discussion of Christian knowledge would correct the morals of men, restrain their vices, and preserve the peace in society. Now, this new bill would not support exclusively the Episcopal Church. Rather, it would raise a fund of tax dollars, and then it would support all the Christian churches, and each monies would be apportioned based on the number of adherents to each sect. The bill, of course, met heavy opposition from men like Madison, who strongly disagreed with providing any funds to any church. The bill lost some of its momentum when both of the major sponsors of the bill left the Assembly. Henry was elected governor of Virginia. Lee left to serve as president of the Continental Congress. After their departure from the Assembly, Madison managed to delay any assessment bill until the next session of the Assembly. With everyone aware that a bill on assessments would be taken up again in the fall, both sides spent the spring and summer of 1785 trying to make their case to the public and to members of the legislature. Advocates argued that society needed organized religion and that religion simply could not survive without government support. In response to this, James Madison wrote his famous Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. Madison laid out 15 points, beginning by quoting the 1776 Virginia Bill of Rights, that true religion, quote, can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. Government uses force. Religion must persuade voluntary adoption. He noted that men accepted religion, often even devoting their lives to religions that were contrary to what the government required, so of course religion could exist without being imposed by civil authorities. Infringement on this freedom to follow one's own conscience in following God is a form of tyranny. It's a form of enslavement, depriving a free people of this right. He went on to argue that civil servants are no experts in the truth of any religion and are ill-equipped to judge that point on behalf of others. Madison noted that minority religions often thrived without government support, pointing out that Quakers and Mennonites as examples of this. He also noted that the assessment would be inherently unequal, favoring certain sects over others. He attacked established religions generally as having a poor history. Quote, "During the almost 15 centuries, has the legal establishment of Christianity been on trial, and what have been its fruits? More or less, in all places, pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and civility in the laity, in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution. Government," Madison contended, "could operate just fine without religion, and the religion could operate just fine without government." He noted that lack of government support for any religion over the past few years had not destroyed religion. It had, in fact, resulted in moderation and harmony among the existing sects. Madison concluded by again quoting the Virginia Bill of Rights, which guaranteed, quote, "the equal right of every citizen to the free exercise of his religion according to the dictates of his conscience." If the assessment bill made this right of religion unequal, then all the basic rights for which they had fought could come up for adjustment by the legislature as well. Many of the minority religions, which had gotten along fine without government support for decades, also joined in the opposition to this bill. Although the assessment bill had started through a committee of Presbyterians, the Presbyterian congregations called a convention that summer in which the majority condemned the assessment and the Incorporation Act. The Baptists, who until recently had seen their preachers imprisoned for preaching, also opposed the assessment. They greatly distrusted the government to operate fairly in this area. Baptist petitions called the assessment, quote, "contrary to the spirit of the gospel and the Bill of Rights." It was during this time that the Episcopal Church suffered another major break. A group of Episcopal reformers broke away, calling themselves the Methodist Church. Methodism had existed before the Revolution as a separate voice, but inside the Anglican Church. It considered itself to be Anglican. Part of this might have been in order to receive government protection and avoid government sanction. It had maintained this association despite an increasingly different view of theology, preaching style, and organizational structure, all different from the mainstream Anglicans. In the independent U.S., there was no longer a need to pretend that Methodists and Episcopalians agreed on these things. They separated to form their own church. The result was a large group of Virginia Methodists who also opposed this assessment bill. In May, the Virginia Episcopal leaders met at a convention in Richmond. As a result of the Incorporation Act, church leaders for the first time had the authority to organize their religion on their own without oversight from the legislature. They elected the Reverend James Madison as their leader. This was not the James Madison that we're thinking of. Rather, it was a cousin who had the same name. The convention revealed that even within the Episcopal Conference, there was a great deal of disagreement on how the church should have moved forward on issues of dogma and organization. The convention made considerable changes to the liturgy and the Book of Common Prayer, approving 43 different changes to church canon. It further put the main authority over the church in the convention, which would meet repeatedly and included both clergy and lay people. Between conventions, a committee would handle matters that could not wait. It made the power of the bishop purely advisory. The convention was made up primarily of members of Virginia's political and social elite. During the Richmond Convention, they mixed regularly with the governor, the council, and judges. This only confirmed the view of other religions that the Episcopal Church in Virginia was part of the establishment and would never allow the other sects to compete on an equal basis. Over the course of the fall of 1785, opposition to the assessment bill only grew larger. Without majority support, leaders would not bring the matter to a vote. Sensing the strength of the opposition, Madison reintroduced Jefferson's bill for establishing religious freedom. The legislature voted on Jefferson's bill in January 1786, This time it passed with wide support. The statute's passage meant that Virginia could never compel anyone to support a religion, financially or otherwise. With that, the assessment bill was dead. While many across the continent celebrated Virginia's passage of the Bill for Religious Liberty, critics saw it as the end of virtue in society. One prominent Philadelphia minister published a pamphlet attacking the Virginia statute. He argued that it was, quote, a general declamation against all religion, and that under the specious appearance of establishing religious freedom, it actually tends to remove the necessity of any religion whatsoever among the people. And despite this opposition, more generally, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom was received favorably. Jefferson was still serving in Paris when he received word of its passage. He immediately translated the statute into several languages and had it circulated throughout Europe. The legislature also ended up repealing the Episcopal Articles of Incorporation, spinning off the church to operate outside of any government control, just like any other religion. Next week, we're going to head to Massachusetts, where Daniel Shays starts a rebellion. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, and Michael Mulhern. Thanks also to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Richard McCabe, TJ Walker, and Curtis Johnson. I really appreciate everyone who supports this podcast. This week, we covered the treatment of religion following the Revolution. Now, this, of course, was just a snapshot of the issue in one state, Virginia. The experience in Virginia was not necessarily the same in every state. In fact, several states, including Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, continued to have state-supported religions well into the 1800s. A majority of states had some sort of religious tests to hold public office. Some even had religious restrictions on the right to vote. I've sometimes been asked to weigh in on the debate about whether the United States was founded as a Christian nation. I suppose it depends what one means by that. The overwhelming majority of Americans during this time period considered themselves to be Christians. But there was also a very strong movement to keep religion and government separate. States, as I said, continued to have state religions, but this was more of a long-standing tradition, and all of the state religions were removed by the 1830s. The vast majority of founders expressed opposition to having government endorse any religion, including Christianity generally. You can point to a handful of leaders that felt otherwise, but the general consensus seemed to be that government should not be Christian or any other sort of religion. As was stressed by people like Jefferson and Madison, religion must be adopted voluntarily and should never be imposed by the state. That quickly became the consensus in America. Of course, you can find leaders, even prominent ones, who disagreed with the majority view, but that was the way that everything seemed to be moving. Many proponents of a state religion believed that churches could not survive without tax dollars and that people would be too stingy with donations, causing churches to wither and die. Of course, as was already the case by 1784, there were a great many non-approved religions that were thriving. The churches that seemed to grow the fastest after this time were the evangelical churches that actively recruited new members and were effective in raising voluntary contributions. Churches in America have, of course, thrived under this system. Following the end of state religions, America underwent what has been called the Second Great Awakening, beginning in the 1790s, where evangelical churches spread through communities, resulting in massive growth of those sects. People were able to find a religion that they truly believed in, rather than simply having to go to the church that was mandated by the state. This strengthened religious memberships in America. Personal religious identification is still higher in the U.S. than it is in much of Europe, where state religions lingered for much longer, and in fact still technically exist, at least in some countries. Thomas Jefferson was particularly proud of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. It's one of the 3 accomplishments he thought should be listed on his grave, the other 2 being author of the Declaration of Independence and founder of the University of Virginia. In Europe, wars over religious differences continued to rage. In America, the freedom of religion prevented that. When the U.S. Constitution was adopted, there was a requirement that there be no religious test for public office. And of course, a few years later, the Bill of Rights also mandated that there be no established religion for the U.S. and that people were free to exercise religion pursuant to their own conscience. Of course, the constitutional requirement originally only applied to the federal government. It did not apply to state governments until after courts decided that the 14th Amendment required states to adhere to these ideas as well. Even without that federal restriction, or in the early 1800s, all states had chosen on their own to do away with their state religions. In the 19th century, Europe did away with most of the legal limitations on religious dissenters. Even countries that still have an official religion, like the Church of England, have learned to exist on voluntary donations rather than mandatory taxation. The end of a religious establishment and the acceptance of religious freedom had become the norm in most of the Western world. My book recommendation this week is entitled Establishing Religious Freedom, Jefferson's Statute in Virginia, by Thomas Buckley. This book gives a good insight into the debate over religious liberty in Virginia and the events that led to the final passage of the statute. The book is over 350 pages, but the last 100 pages or so are notes and index. One reason I picked this book as my recommendation over several others on the topic is that its focus really is on the history of the subject, not on the modern-day debates about how far to take establishment or religious freedom in modern society. The author, Thomas Buckley, was a Catholic priest who was also a history professor at Loyola Marymount University. He passed away in 2017, 3 years after the publication of this book. There's a copy of this book on archive.org if you want to take a look at it before buying. But if you want to read more on this topic, get a copy of Establishing Religious Freedom, Jefferson's Statute in Virginia, by Thomas Buckley. My online recommendation is the pamphlet by James Madison that I discussed during the main episode. He had authored this during the debate. It was called Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. I think Madison lays out the debate quite well and makes the argument as good as anyone at the time as to why established state religions are a bad idea. My blog and website include direct links to this document, which is available at Founders Online in the National Archives. My question this week asks, was the American Revolution inevitable? Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by that question. Was it inevitable that the two sides went to war in 1775? Or was it inevitable that the war would result in an American victory? I think we'd probably all agree that the answer to those two questions is no. The British had multiple opportunities to prevent the war from starting in the first place. The Patriot protesters were looking for political reforms, not war and independence. Even after the fighting at Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress still sent the Olive Branch petition, hoping that the king would intervene in the crisis and broker a compromise plan between the colonies and Parliament. It was only after the king sided 100% with Parliament and called for an army to be sent to suppress the rebellion that war became inevitable. Now, one reason the colonists were so reluctant to go to war was that most of them thought they had little chance of winning. There was no regular army in America. The colonial militias were notoriously ineffective against regulars. There was no experienced officer corps. There were few facilities for making arms, and there was no established way to raise money to fight a war. All of these factors led both sides to believe that the war would end poorly for the colonies. That was why Britain was willing to take this dispute into an armed conflict, and why the colonial leaders had to get pushed into it. Now, this leads to the other interpretation of the question. Was revolt and independence more generally inevitable? I think the answer to that is yes. The colonies were growing in population and economic power at a massive rate. They were quickly going to surpass Britain itself. As Thomas Paine pointed out in Common Sense, it made no sense for an island to rule a continent. Of course, Britain could have put in place certain reforms that could have kept the colonies happy, but Parliament would have had to continue to cede power to the point where it became a political minority within its own empire. It seems unlikely that members of Parliament would ever be willing to go that far. So, with this power imbalance, it seems that some issue, at some point, be it trade, slavery, the Napoleonic Wars, or something else, would eventually create a political separation, and that the United Colonies could compel independence. Empires are built on the ability of the leaders to keep their subjects divided and fighting with one another. That way, the government can be seen as the arbiter trying to protect each group from the other. When those groups unite against the leadership, it's over. While there was a sizable loyalist element in America, Britain overestimated their size and influence when the colonies united against Britain. I suppose it's possible that there could have been a peaceful separation, such as when Britain created its Commonwealth and effectively gave independence to other large British entities like Australia or Canada. Those were peaceful separations. However, I'd argue that the reason Britain allowed places like Australia and Canada to separate was that they saw that failure to do so would lead to armed revolt. They realized that that would be no good for anyone, and that setting up this peaceful division of powers between geographically separate entities, effectively creating new countries, would be the better way to handle it. I think they realized that because of the example of the American Revolution, which meant that if they did not cede power voluntarily, it would be taken from them in a violent way. And of course, the American Revolution was a part of the learning process for British officials. So I think American independence from Britain was inevitable, but it was not inevitable that it would happen in 1776. It could have happened under different circumstances and perhaps a generation or two later, but the break was inevitable. If you have a question that you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.